Thank you, Marcia. Thank you very much, and thank you for your support and your ongoing support that's been there for such a long time, and Josephine, yours as well. I'm involved in a program and have been since about 2007, ladies and gentlemen. It's taken a long time to get traction, but it's starting to get some traction now, which is good news. And Lani, thank you for having the courage to stand here today. I've heard you talk a number of times, and it's difficult to do, I know, but you're a very courageous woman. There are a couple of heroes in the room that I want to mention, people who've just been there in support for the work that I'm doing. One is Des Rogers, who's sitting there, and he's a traditional man from Alice Springs. He's just been a great support all along the way, and John Morgan I can see sitting over there. John, you too have just, in your own quiet way, have been great support for the work that we're doing, and we need that sort of support. Ladies and gentlemen, on Christmas Day this year, 37 women had Christmas just like we did, and probably celebrated it with their family. And on New Year's Eve, those same 37 women probably sat down and thought, I'm going to have a New Year's resolution, I'm going to walk away from this violence, and I'm going to have a new year, and everything's going to be good for me. And they're dead, they're gone. The 37 of them are gone. Their families are dysfunctional, their children don't have a mum, and they're gone. And that'll continue to happen. They were the victims. They died at the hands of a partner or ex-partner, and their lives are gone, and we forget about them, and we should never forget that, because that figure is just a little over halfway through the year. So if it continues, you know what we're going to have by the end of the year. And I want to say to you, last year in Australia, 500,000 women. So if you think about that, 500,000 women in Australia were either sexually or physically abused. 500,000. If you do the sums, that's one every minute. So if I talk here for 10 minutes, another 10 women in Australia have either been sexually or physically abused, and it just continues to climb. And so we have to do something about it. There's a challenge in front of us to do something about it. My background, I worked before I joined the ABC in 1994 in child protection and family violence work. I did about 17 years of that work. And ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you, I held in my hands, in my arms, the 4-year-old girl that was sexually assaulted by an uncle. I've seen the smashed women lying on the floors of homes that I visit. I saw the broken bones. I saw death, I saw destruction, I saw this horrible picture of this is our world that we live in. And I poked my head inside there and I had a look, and I've been stuck with it ever since, and I can't pull myself away from it despite working in the ABC. I can't leave that alone. When I hear Lani speak here, I say, that's why we do this. That's why we do this. And I ask you to think about this, because I know when we talk about this and you think about it, you think this is terrible, we all have to do something about it, and then we don't. You've got to put in your voice as well. You've got to stand up very strongly and say no more to family violence. It's got to be a main issue for us to deal with in this country. We don't want it to continue. And we can't ask the women to fix this problem. They can't do it alone. They've struggled hard for such a long time. They need support, and they need us support, so they need men to stand up well. And look, let me make this point. This is not an Indigenous issue, family violence. It's not an Indigenous issue. It's an issue right across Australia. And it's not just women who get abused, men get abused as well. I know that, and I understand all of that. But I know in this room here, when I'm talking to you, I've heard one victim here, but you know what? I know in this room here there are some more victims. I know that. You're sitting there and you're thinking about this. And I know there are perpetrators sitting in this room as well, and you're sitting thinking about it as well. And we do need to do a lot more work in this space. I've been talking about, and Marcia mentioned it before, about Adam Goodes and that situation with racism in Australia. And the outcome of all of that? I mean, it started off with, is this a racial taunt against Adam Goodes? Is that what it is? But the discussion has moved on from then. It's no longer a discussion about, is it a racial taunt against Adam Goodes? It's just accepted that it was. And so it's an issue about racism, and we have to deal with it. So that problem, that small problem, was almost shifted in a couple of days. But this problem has been lingering and staying there for such a long time, and we do need to give it some impetus and do something about it. So the program I'm involved in started with me travelling around the territory in 2007, talking firstly to Indigenous men. I was asked to travel around the territory and talk to, you're not going to believe this, but to ask Indigenous men about pornography and the classification of pornography. Did they understand what it all meant? And I said, I'm happy to do that, but I want to talk to men about family violence as well and ask them why they don't have a discussion about it. When we called public meetings in 2006 and 2007 and 2008 to talk about family violence and child abuse, the men didn't turn up. Largely women, always was the case. A couple of men would turn up. And I didn't know why that was. So I asked while I travelled around, could I talk to men? And I came here. I had meetings here in Yirrkala, I had meetings in Nhulunbuy. I travelled all through the territory, 38 communities I went to. I sat down with men and we had a discussion. Why don't we turn up and talk about this issue? Just two strong reasons came out from men in the bush. One, they didn't understand the language. They didn't understand the terminology. They didn't know what we were saying when we said substantiated abuse. It didn't make any sense to them. So they didn't understand it, so why go along to it if they don't know the language, don't know the terminology? And the second part of it, of course, is if they turned up, they felt people will say, well, he's a perpetrator, that's why he's here, listening to that. So it was really difficult for men to do something about that. But in more recent times, men have started to have a discussion about that, and then more and more men are starting to have a discussion. More and more men are coming up with ideas about how we can do some work to make this, make a difference in this space. When I travelled through Central Australia and visited many of those old communities out in the Western Desert region, I sat down with the old man. I said, this is not just a problem for your community, You got family violence problems here, but they have it all over Australia as well. And I'd start to tell them about what the size of that problem. Here's some stats about this problem. And those old fellas would look back at me out at Yuendumu and Yullamu and Papunya, sit down with them, and they'd look at me and they'd do in this great Aboriginal statement, they'd say, no more. No more, no more. And Aboriginal people know, no more means get rid of it. So if someone dies, it's no more, he's finished. So no more means something completely different when it comes from their lips, It means something completely different. They're saying no more, get rid of it. They also said things like, well, men should link up. Men should link up. And they're right, men should link up. And so we put together the No More campaign, which some of you will know is when football teams and sporting teams walk out on the ground, they link their arms together to make a symbolic statement as they as a team and they as men say no more to family violence. So that's the first little bit that raises the awareness in the community, and it's taken a long time for that to actually catch on, but more and more people now know about it, and sporting teams do it themselves, not just in the territory. We see them do it in the SANFL, we saw them do it in the AFL, NRL do it, we've seen teams do it. Teams overseas are talking about doing that. In New Zealand, we know they're doing it. So it becomes a strong statement that we make. So that's the first part of it, but the next part is what's important, because men will go out and do that, make the strong statement, but then what? What happens next after that? So we've got to have the action, which you were talking about. So there needs to be an action. So we developed a thing that we call the Domestic Violence Action Plan, which is a plan that clubs actually write. They sit down and write clearly in their plan, this is what this club stands for. We're the Parramatta Eels, and they're the first national team to write a domestic violence action plan. This is who we are, this is what we stand for, and this is what we're going to do about domestic violence. And they invited me to go to Parramatta and talk to them about it. Not to the players, ladies and gentlemen, don't talk to the players. They said talk to the staff. So they pulled all the staff together, 45 staff, and asked me to talk to them. So I talked about it to them, and they were told by the CEO of Parramatta, this is your responsibility as much as it is the players. And then I have an opportunity to talk to the players as well. So that whole club now has this understanding and this commitment to do something about domestic violence. I said to them, how big is your reach, Parramatta? Who can you reach? They said, we reach 500,000 people. 500,000 people they would reach. So they can influence, one club can influence 500,000 people. And I want to tell you this, I had an opportunity, thanks to Josephine who arranged this for me, to meet with the CEOs of all the major sporting codes in Australia. I think there were 7 of them that turned up. And we spoke to them. We went along, we had a meeting with them in Sydney, and we talked about the No More campaign, we talked about domestic violence action plans, we challenged them to do something about it. What can you do about this? Do you know what they told us? They said our reach as sporting codes in Australia is 8 million Australians. Those sporting codes reach 8 million Australians. Just imagine if those sporting codes together came out and said really strongly, we do not accept violence against our women and children, and we say no more to family violence. Imagine if they said that. 8 million people would be influenced in Australia. If those 8 million people tell someone else, 8 million could become 16 million, and then the problem starts to get dealt with. So it's a good way to go. It's a strong way to go. And just recently, Josephine, I had a call from the head of the NRL saying, we want this to happen with all our clubs. We want the NRL to send out the strongest message. And I know we ask a lot of sport, but sport has a responsibility as well. I mean, sport do pretty well out of Australia, and sport have to do something about it. We think they're the target group for us. And look, I don't want to bag sport, but, you know, one sporting club or one sporting code, you know, had a death there where, you know, a child was killed on the field in front of his mother, killed by his father in front of his mother on the field. And you know what? They've been silent about this issue. They've been silent about this issue, and they should not be. I mean, what else would move you if you saw that in front of you and you're responsible for that code? What else do you need to make you move and do something about that? They didn't move on it, and I challenge them to move on it and do something about it, and I'm hoping that they will. I'm hoping all those sporting codes will get together. So we work in that field, we continue to work in that field, and we will for years to come, I know that, but we'll draw more people in. And if you come away out of here today thinking you'd like to do something about it, as Marcy said, go to the website, you know, be a supporter, say that you want difference to happen. Because, you know, I'll tell you this with the government in Australia, if you tell them that this is a key issue, that they have to do something about it, they will do something about it. Because they won't otherwise. It'll be the flavour of the month for a little while, and then they'll move on and something else will come up. Do you know what I'd like to see? I'd like to see 1 million Australians on there saying, do something about the family violence. Do something to make this a better community for us. And then I can go to the government and I say, have a look at that. There's 1 million Australians. You would not want to turn your back on 1 million Australians who ask you to do something about it. That's as little as the contribution is you can make, is to go there and make a strong statement. So much in this space, ladies and gentlemen, that we have to do. We are seeing some results. You know, we've seen where people have domestic violence action plans, that there is a reduction in the level of family violence. We know this for a fact. When men walk out on the field, on footy fields, and they link their arms together and make a strong statement, symbolically, we stand up against family violence, there is a reduction. There is a reduction. It's just that it doesn't last. It comes back up again. I'm at loss to explain why we do that, but why men hurt women. I don't quite understand it yet, but I know this. I know two things important here. Men do not like to be seen to be failing in the eyes of other men. They don't like that. They don't like to be seen to be failing in the eyes of other men. So I think men can challenge other men about this. And the other thing, I think the terminology we're using, words like domestic violence orders, DVOs, are just too soft. They are far too soft. Men just rolls out of off their tongues now. I've got a DVO. It's a standard sort of thing. It's, you know, I think we need to name this for what it is. I think we need to say to those men who hurt their women, you are a woman basher. That's who you are. You are a woman basher. Name it as it is. That's what you are. And men will not like to have that sort of tag in front of them. And I think men can stop this behaviour. I think they can do it. We've seen them stop other things in their lives. We can see them stop this. So it's a call to arms for men. I'm not going to go because I think we're running out of time, are we?
Take your time.
Oh, okay.
You're happy with that?
Yeah. And I'm happy to take some questions from here, from the floor as well. But we want to do this not just for our women and not just for the society we live in today, but we need to do it for the future of Australia. We need to do it for the kids, as the previous speaker was talking about a short time ago about, you know, how important it is that we do things for our kids. This is something. Isn't this something we should do for our kids? Wouldn't it be great if before we left this earth, before we walked away from this planet, who by the sounds of the previous speaker may be doomed anyway, but before we walk away, wouldn't it be good to leave behind a mark from all of us that we made a difference around this issue, because we know it'll just continue to grow and grow and grow. So I don't want to preach too much to you. You know what the problem is. What you need to have a think about is what you're prepared to do about it. So I'm happy to take any questions from the floor, any comments from the floor if you want to do that. Yes, Bob, how are you? Yeah, alcohol. I mean, alcohol's a massive problem, Bob. But I'll tell you something. For the first part of this discussion we were having with men, we'd say, "Why does this violence happen?" And they'd say, "Oh, because I was drunk. You know, I was on the grog and I had easy access to alcohol." They don't say that anymore because it's not an excuse. It's not an excuse. I drink too, you know, and I'll admit, once I was drunk. That was fun. That was a joke. I'll warn you when the joke comes in. But I never hurt anybody. You know, I never hurt my wife or partner. You know, I didn't do that, and nor do a lot of men. So, you know, we do need to deal with the alcohol problem. I know that, you know, but that's not an excuse for men to have. You know, there are other things that need to come into discussion. But thanks for the question. So.
Can we get your mic?
Sorry, yeah, just get you that mic.
I'd just like to
That's on.
congratulate you both, and for Lani to get up and speak like that too. It's just really great and terrible story, but just people speaking out is really important. What worries me is, and I just wonder, the question is, with education, I mean, what it seems to happen is when families go through these terrible circumstances, the children copy. And it's got to start with education with the children. And I just wonder, do you know of any programs out there? I'm involved in education, and I just want to know if there's any programs out there we can start with the children that are going to our schools. So, you know, when they're growing up, it's going to change.
That's a great question. Thank you very much. And we are, through this program, actually talking to the education department now. It's trying to find at what age group do you start to work with the kids? When do you start to influence them around this topic? And I can tell you this, I think that kids, you know, as young as 6 and 7 years of age, not just ones who witness violence within their home, but boys at the age of 6 and 7 start to realise that they can dominate the young girls. They start to bully them, they start to push them around, they start to make them do things that they want them to do, and the girls don't normally do it. So I reckon that's about the area we should be working with. There's been lots of thought that maybe you do it when the kids are teenagers, but I think it needs to be much earlier than that, and we're talking with the education department about us doing some of the work in that space. The problem for us, of course, is we don't have the funding, we don't have the workers that can do all that sort of work. It needs to happen, and if government starts to put some funding that way, then it's likely to happen. But it's an area that we're working on. Thank you for the question.
Is this working?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, am I loud enough? No. Well, I do yarning with schools. I work in schools. I go in there and show my documentary, and I open up a yarning session. So if anyone wants me to come to their school, you know, contact me or come up and have a yarn with me, because it does work. I'm huge for prevention. You know, when with a lot of kids, they need to see visually. You know, you could sit here and talk about, like, someone could show my story, and then when I'm there, it's a total different impact on kids. And you know, when you start talking about, you know, I think with family violence, you know, it has a lot to do with trauma. A lot of things are trauma-based. You know, from my childhood, I thought it was normal, but when kids start getting educated that it isn't right and it isn't normal and you need to say no, and they start, you know, even though it's happening at home, if they're getting educated that it isn't right, they're going to start questioning, well, what's really going on at my house? You know, and I've seen kids before that have stand up in front of their parents. I went on a march in Western Australia one year, and I had a little boy that was walking alongside of me in this march, and his mother and father were hovering around in the streets, and they started seeing that their son was walking, and their little boy, he was about 9 years old, he turned around and said, "Mum, I say no to violence." And the mum was sort of like, "What?" And he turned to his dad and he said, "I want you to stop beating up my mum." And he kept walking. That is huge when kids make a stand.
Thanks. I just talked about the domestic violence action plan in more detail.
So Charlie's going to conclude the session, and then you can catch up with Lani and Charlie later and ask them questions, because we've run over time and we're holding up some very important people.
Thank you. Look, so just the last couple of minutes just to explain the Domestic Violence Action Plan. So when you walk here, you'll know what it is. So it's that plan that's written by a sporting club. And in the Territory, it was done, I mean, it came out of the Territory, and the Nightcliff Football Club, who some of you will know, actually wrote the first Domestic Violence Action Plan. We work with them. Here's a football club that hasn't won a grand final since 1968, and their whole focus in life was to win a grand final year after year after year, frustrated when they never ever won it. We will win a grand final, we'll do this, we'll be hard, we'll be tough, we're going to do all of this, but they weren't winning grand finals. And eventually one day they had a problem within their club where they thought a boy was going to commit suicide and wanted some help. We were talking to them, and unbelievably at that same time we talked to them about domestic violence and how it might be happening in the club. And an incident happened at that club at that same time. A senior player in one of their teams hit his girlfriend. Never done it before in his life, but he hit her and he smashed her face up. And she was a player in their local team, and she couldn't play on the weekend, and the other girls come around to see her, but she wouldn't come out. And so they knew, as women do, if she wouldn't come out, you know, that's probably what's happened. But they got their way into the room and saw her, and her face was smashed up. And so they took a photo of her and they sent it to the club, and they said to the club, this is what one of our players has done to one of our players. What are we going to do about it? And all of a sudden the football club says, wow, we've got to do something about this. So we talked more to them about doing something with that. Meanwhile, that guy was then charged by the police, and the club decided, as they were working on the domestic violence action plan, that they would stand him down. So you can't come back and play in the club until this matter gets dealt with. He eventually went to jail for 3 months, and they wrote in their plan that if that happens in their club again, he would be stood down, and then if he comes out of prison, before he can come back, he must talk to the club. He must talk to the whole club, which they did do. They set it up in a room, they shut everybody out. They had the Division 1 team, the Premier League team and the women's team. And I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, he stood before them for 15 minutes and he tried to tell them what had happened with this incident. He tried to explain it to him. And like you, Lani, he was reduced to tears. It was really difficult for him to do. And he told them that he sat in prison for 3 months on sentence for this. Every second he realised some things had happened. He'd lost his girlfriend. He'd lost his family. His 12-year-old son said, Dad, I don't want anything to do with you again. I mean, he was just totally isolated. He'd lost his footy club. He couldn't go back to his footy club either. His life had come to an end. Do you know how long it took for that to happen? One punch, ladies and gentlemen, took him 3 seconds. 3 seconds, bang, he throws a punch and his whole life is destroyed. He tried to make that message to the team. He said, fellas, you can't do this. You can't do this. You have to have a think about this. And he pleaded with them to do something about it. It was the most impassioned and powerful speech I ever heard from a man to his other men. I've been in many football team rooms before, and generally men, when they get moved, will shake hands or give him a slap on the back and say, we're the brother, we'll stand up. They hugged him. They walked up to him and they hugged him. And they said, we can't let this happen in our club. And the club took on the responsibility to stop the family violence. And in their plan, domestic violence action plan, one thing was missing. There were not enough women having a say about how that club should operate. So they wrote in their plan, women need to be involved at the decision-making level within the management committee. And so they appointed women to the management committee. And the management committee then said, you know, our focus has been about winning premierships for the last 30 years. Now we need to focus on something else, this other body of work that needs to be done. And so they wrote in their plan that they were going to do something for children with a disability. What's that got to do with the footy club? The women said it's got a lot to do with the footy club. So the men were then invited to actually set up places at the ground when the team played footy to allow people with a disability to come in and watch and to meet them at the gate and escort them in. So you're thinking, what's this got to do with domestic violence? But it was them reaching outside football, reaching outside the desire to win a premiership, and they worked with people with a disability. Then the women said to them, here's another thing we could do. We could get football guernseys, and on the back we can write a number of the age of a woman in our club that was when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Write a number on the back and get it. They did it. 54, 38. Whatever, they got 20 odd Guernseys, they trained in them and then they auctioned them off within the club, and they raised about $5,000 and gave it back to the Anti-Cancer Council, you know, which is a great thing for them. And meanwhile out there in the broader community, people are listening to this. People who don't play footy, families who haven't got kids playing footy said, this is a bit interesting, I like the sound of this club. So more and more kids come to play for the club. More and more kids come to play for the club. That said, the family be sitting home, who will we play footy for? Well, we think our little fellas or our little girls are going to play for Nightcliff. And all of a sudden, they couldn't handle all the kids. So they had to make more teams, more Nightcliff junior teams. And you know what? Last year, in the final series here, they won them all. The 14s, the 16s, the 18s, they won them all because they got all the kids. So if there's ever a powerful message for clubs to do something about it, there it is. That's how strong that can be. And those kids are there and they're proud to be part of that club, and they'll probably go through the process up to Premier League, and all of a sudden they'll dominate the competition. Anyway, there's lots of good things happening in that space. Thank you so much for your time today, Lani. Thank you.
Got some